Hello and welcome to SpyHards podcast, where your hosts go deep undercover into the world of spy movies to decipher which films make the knock list. But remember, this information is strictly for your ears only. I'm Agent Scott.
It's 2:45 p.m. in a secluded cottage less than 1 hour's drive from Langley, BC. Cam the provocateur sits at his computer, ready to record a podcast.
Yeah, so that's a thing. Get ready for a lot more narration, guys, because this film's chock-a-block.
Narration the movie.
Yeah. The house on Narration Street. Cam, I guess the question is, what are we doing this week?
We are talking about the 1945 World War II espionage film, The House on 92nd Street. I guess, crime docudrama with heavy affiliations from the FBI. So this is going to be a very interesting movie to talk about, and I hope everyone listening made an effort to track this movie down and watch it, because I think you will be greatly rewarded, at the very least, taking part in this conversation.
I think watching the film lends a lot to hearing us talk about it. Maybe not lends to your time committed to the film. But hey-ho. Now, before we go on about this film, we originally had another film lined up. But because we realized that you can't find the film on streaming currently, although it looks like that might change in the future, we had to last minute swap around and pick this film out of our vaults to check out. So, I mean, it hasn't really affected our review or anything, but it's just interesting that we had to sort of find this one, really.
Yeah, because originally we were doing a 1940s Warner Brothers film that's just not out there at all. My guess is it'll pop up on HBO Max at some point in the future, and hopefully we'll review it then. I'm not going to reveal what it was, but that opened up a gap, and I knew I wanted to do something from the 1940s. And just because of, in terms of what we've been covering lately, we haven't done a 40s film in a while. And so I hopped around a few, and completely happened upon this one just arbitrarily. It was on our list, but it was one I added at some point, potentially in a fever dream late at night, just adding random espionage films to our list. And it was available everywhere, so if you haven't seen it, you can find it on pretty much any Apple movie rental site, or Google Play, or what have you, YouTube. And so that made it very appealing for that reason alone. And boy, I was not sure what we were getting. I mean, you figure 1945, it's probably got some, propaganda elements to it, which is always interesting. We talked about that when we did a little bit of that in Notorious, as well as Ministry of Fear. Ministry of Fear much more so. So I was interested in that angle, but the movie that I got was profoundly different than what I expected walking in.
And yet, not profound.
Well, we'll talk about that.
Well, let's talk about the film itself, the synopsis for the film. Now, I would like to state that we have not been paid by the FBI to do this film yet. We are waiting for our checks. Although I wonder where Cam got this film from. Maybe it was a secret email to our inbox, just suggesting it with an unknown source. I don't know.
The ghost of Edgar Hoover sent the email.
Yeah, he's skeletons or rat-a-tat-tapping on a keyboard, sending it over to you. Well, here we are. The House on 92nd Street. The FBI's own tense, terrific story behind the protection of the atomic bomb. The US government tries to track down embedded Nazi agents in the States.
I guess. I read that synopsis actually before you read it. I don't normally do that, but I just was so fascinated by this movie after watching it. I dove down the rabbit hole of Letterboxd reviews, and that synopsis, I mean, I guess it sells the concept of what the movie is, but I don't even know if it makes any attempt to tell you what the movie's about, really.
What the actual story is.
Yeah, like, I'm not even sure I can tell you right now what the story of this movie is, but...
Well, I can jump in.
Yeah.
IMDb has a different one, which I'm sure you can see too, which I think maybe gives you the plot a little bit more. which is simply Bill Dietrich becomes a double agent for the FBI in a Nazi spy ring.
Yeah, I guess.
That's
Yeah,
kind of it.
yeah.
That's kind of it.
It's a tough one to really give a synopsis to. Like, I don't really fault anyone who has struggles to write a coherent one for this movie because it's a strange movie.
Well, I mean, I don't want to jump into our thoughts on it just yet, so I'll probably keep that to myself for now. But I don't know overall what this film is aimed at. I'm hoping you have some information on the background of the film to sort of lead us in, because I don't know what this was pitched at. It came out in 1945, I think about a month after the war ended. Quite a pivotal moment in
Yeah,
history.
yeah.
Post World War II, post dropping of the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which this film is dealing with the creation of the nuclear bomb.
Sort of. We'll get into that.
Yeah, so I'm just curious as to what this film was pitched as, because it was obviously made during the end of the war, about the end of the war, but brought out after the war. There's such a massive change in the world in those space of those few months.
Yeah, yeah, no kidding. I mean, I think it's really interesting. We're recording this, at the beginning of June, kind of as the pandemic seems to be maybe heading towards some normalcy. You're in London. I'm in Vancouver, BC. So the States is kind of ahead of us in terms of trying to return to normalcy. But it's interesting just how much things can change quickly, versus like a handful of months ago, it didn't seem like this, like where we are right now in terms of vaccines and all that. This feels like a movie made at a very critical time that was released sort of tying into the moments that were going on, but also like the world had changed a bit at this point as well.
Yeah, because to my knowledge, my experience of propaganda films so far have been Ministry of Fear. That's about it, really.
Hmm. Yeah.
That we've covered certainly, and that was made during the war. And the idea of propaganda films is to sort of bring up the attitudes, make everyone happy at home, potentially drive people to sign up, the armies and whatnot. Whereas this was made as I feel like it's a propaganda film personally, but brought out after the war when propaganda isn't necessarily what you need anymore.
I think it's more of a propaganda film about the FBI and the importance of the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover was very into the idea of publicizing the FBI as the ultimate force of good. This is at the mid 40s. The 1950s, we're going to get all of the House of Un-American Activities stuff coming in. This feels like kind of a wind-up as the FBI is your friend, running surveillance on you all the time in an effort to maintain the sanity of your world. We are the justice keepers, basically.
Hmm. Which is, I don't know. I definitely felt that. Again, we're getting into what I think about the film. That whole vibe of it being a propaganda film for the FBI makes total sense, because the first 20 minutes is basically a narrative of about the good work the FBI is doing to uncover these Nazi spies. And to me, that's actually some of the more interesting bits of the film, is actually seeing all these, and this is real clips of actually people at work deciphering code and piecing together strips of shredded paper, like we're in Argo all of a sudden.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and using X-ray mirrors.
Yeah, which they were all very amazed by.
Yeah, the idea of a two-sided mirror was like super exciting to the filmmakers here.
I can imagine the audience just being like, yeah, yeah, yeah,
Money shot.
look at that mirror, you can see right through it. Oh my god. But yeah, Cam, what do you have about this film? Because I imagine there's not much being an older film.
Okay, there's actually a lot. This movie, for one that has maybe faded into obscurity, there's actually quite a lot in terms of the behind the scenes on this one. So, I guess the story, in some ways, starts with a director, Henry Hathaway. Henry Hathaway is someone who would very much grow into a director people recognize as an important filmmaker of his time. He was something of a studio guy, but made a lot of recognizable movies. He directed the John Wayne version of True Grit, the original one that won John Wayne Best Actor. He also did a couple other westerns. He did the John Wayne film, The Sons of Katie Elder, which was a big hit, as well as he co-directed How the West Was Won, a movie we've referenced on this show whenever we talk about the box office of whatever year that was, because it was one of the biggest grossing movies of its time. But at the time, Henry Hathaway was a newer filmmaker. He'd had some hits. In 1935, he had directed The Lives of a Bengal Lancer, starring Gary Cooper, which got an Academy Award nomination for Best Picture as well as Best Director. But he'd mostly kicked around doing a lot of studio films, not a lot of classics on that list, heading from 1935 into 1945. But this same year, basically, as this movie, he directs a film called Nob Hill, which was a period era. I knew you were going to love that. Which was a period era saloon drama. Now, you're a big fan of saloon dramas, right?
No, but I'm a big fan of Nob Hill.
Nob Hill.
I'm here right now. Coming to you live from Nob Hill.
So Hathaway had finished Nob Hill and was looking for his next project. He was working for 20th Century Fox, and he was kind of not that happy with them, but he'd heard about a new script the studio had circulating that concerned the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and it was set in New York. And the script had a lot of buzz around it. It was being fostered by Darryl F. Zanuck, who was the founder and VP of production at 20th Century Fox. And this script had some excitement around it. So Hathaway was able to get a copy of it, and it was written by a pulp novelist named Charles G. Booth. He was a British writer who'd written some stories such as The General Died at Dawn, as well as Sundown. Sundown was turned into a film later. Charles G. Booth also wrote some screenplays. Nothing particularly of note, but he was kind of a working writer at the time. So he'd come up with the story of this movie, and it seemed like something that people were very excited about. And the film had also been co-written along a certain point, and I'm not sure where. This part gets a little lost to history. There's a third writer that I will be able to explain how he joined on, but there was also a writer named Barry Lyndon, who had done some writing on this film as well, and he had written a film that I've seen that's actually pretty fun called The Amazing Dr. Clitterhouse from 1938. Scott, I admire your restraint for not bursting into laughter as soon as I said that title.
Well, I don't know. I had my fill with knobs, so
It's
I don't know how much Clitter Hill I can take.
Clitterhouse, yeah.
Oh.
So that movie stars Edward G. Robinson as a doctor who becomes really fixated on murder and how you could get away with murder. So he becomes a criminal, and it's about him trying to investigate the world of the criminal. So
I'm glad you said he was obsessed with being a criminal and murder, not obsessed with anything else, given the house he lives in.
Very true. So Barry Lyndon also would go on to write War of the Worlds, the original sci-fi classic, as well as the Best Picture winner, Greatest Show on Earth. So he's someone who had credentials. He contributed to this story as well. So Henry Hathaway signs on, and he wants to flesh this thing out a little more, because this movie is actually based on something of a true story. There was an incident called the Duquesne Spy Ring Saga. And this happened during World War II, earlier on. And it surrounded a guy named Fritz Joubert Duquesne. He was a man of South African descent, born in East London. Very interesting character. He was a big game hunter. He was a German soldier, a journalist, and a spy. And he had been operating as a German spy in New York during World War II. And the FBI arrested him, as well as 32 other German spies, on charges of relaying secret information on U.S. weaponry and shipping movements to Germany. 33 members were all sentenced to an accumulated 300 years in prison. Now, at the time, J. Edgar Hoover called it the greatest spy roundup in U.S. history, which, I mean, yeah, probably. I don't know how many spies they would have rounded up in, like, 1899. I don't know. It seems like this makes sense that they would be able to round up a lot during World War II.
Did they have spies during the Civil War?
They did, and there's actually some Civil War spy films on our list to cover, but yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me that this was a big deal, but J. Edgar Hoover loved publicity. And Duquesne got 18 years, served 14, and then died 2 years later. So that was sort of the inspiration for this movie. And there was a man named William G. Siebold who infiltrated the group, and he is who they based the lead character in this movie on. Now, the movie's obviously playing fast and loose with the actual story, but that was the basis. So, Henry Hathaway is signed to do this thing, but he wants to flesh it out a little more. So he hires a writer named John Monks Jr., who was known mostly for a couple plays he'd written. He'd done a play called Brother Rat, which was turned into a film, and he'd also written Brother Rat and a Baby. I feel like the Brother Rat series has been lost to the sands of time. I've never heard of these.
I was just watching it before recording, actually. Yeah. Good stuff.
You're a big Brother Rat guy. That explains the shirt.
I certainly am. Right now, exactly, yeah.
So what happened was they fleshed this out, but there was a vision for this from earlier on even, where they wanted this to be a docudrama. This movie was produced by Louis de Rochemont, who was a maverick filmmaker and documentarian. And so he had a vision as well of this movie being fact-based, and they wanted the participation of the FBI. They wanted this to feel like audiences were getting an inside look at the FBI process. Now, the FBI had a bit of a shaky history with Hollywood. There'd been a movie in the 30s called G-Men, starring Jimmy Cagney, that had been a hit film, and the FBI didn't really like it. They were like, that did not do proper service to what exactly we do. So they had kind of a little bit of a shaky history with Hollywood. But this was the movie that was going to kind of set it right. The FBI would be very involved. FBI agents would play extras throughout the movie and play bit parts. Any moments where you see characters on screen doing research tasks, or what you were talking about, combing through newsprint, they wanted FBI agents doing this on screen. They wanted authenticity. And they also wanted to shoot it something like a documentary, tying back to the producer's background. So this was kind of an experimental movie in a lot of ways, something that was trying to do things that hadn't really been done before in terms of popular mainstream entertainment. They went through a few titles, and I want your opinion on each of these titles, Scott. So I got 3 alternate titles that they toyed with, and before deciding on The House on 92nd Street, which was chosen because it was originally going to be called The House on 93rd Street, but they decided that 92nd sounded better. So that's how they chose that title.
Okay.
Here are the 3 that they toyed with. Number 1, Now It Can Be Told.
Now what can be told? That's the question you always ask back to that. So yeah, I understand skipping that one. Next.
Private Line to Berchtesgaden. I don't know how to pronounce that. Someone who's German speaking could very much ridicule me for that, but I did my best.
I have some German friends, and don't worry, they ridicule you.
Perfect.
No, that makes no sense whatsoever. Keep going.
And finally, my favorite, Hamburg. 777.
I understand the Hamburg reference. What's 777 in reference to?
I'm not sure.
Was that the house number where he did the training?
It probably would have been, except they have commas after each 7.
Right. Well, I don't know if this counts, Cam, but I think I have an alternate title that might top all of them.
Oh, let's hear it.
Yeah. Based on the intel you've just given me, I have come up with what I think is the perfect name for this film, which is The Clit House on 92nd Knob Street.
Sold. Here's your check, sir.
Yes.
Couple other small details I'll mention. The character of Elsa, who's the villain of the film, was originally envisioned as a man. It was going to be a male character who actually dressed as a female later in the film. And I read some studio production notes on the intention behind the original version of the character. And I'm going to let you, make up for your own minds how you think a 1940s studio exec would talk about a male character dressing up as a female character in a film.
Say no more.
Exactly. The other thing I will add is, so this movie concerns, and you referenced this earlier, Process 97, which is the atomic bomb, which is focused on throughout this film, sometimes very vaguely. And that is because that element was added later to capitalize on the Hiroshima-Nagasaki bomb, which happened barely a month before this film was released.
Okay, a couple of quick questions. How was it added in? Are we talking like dubbing?
Well, think about it honestly, throughout the movie. How often do they specifically refer to the atomic bomb versus just talking about Process 97?
Okay, well, the bomb itself is only sort of referenced in the narration stuff. It's Project 97 is what they say, as in like in the interrogation scenes and things like that. So they don't. Okay, I suppose the actors don't ever actually mention a bomb. They just mention this project.
Uh-huh.
So I
Yeah.
guess that's how they did it.
Yeah, like Process 97 I think was something that was just a vaguely sketched in concept. It could be whatever you wanted it to be, and they changed it at the last minute to be the atomic bomb.
But I mean, this whole film hangs its hat on it being based on real events. It even screams at you at the beginning of the film in some really heavy-handed, you know, notes that are put up on the screen. Was the atomic bomb called Process 97?
No, I don't think so.
It's just that was completely made up, and they just conveniently added in the nuclear bomb narration afterwards.
Yeah, and there's also a card that appears at the start of this movie that says, regarding the film, it says it could not be made public until the first atomic bomb dropped on Japan. That was a very sensationalistic tag they put on the movie to make it seem like that's what they were doing all along.
Okay, so really what it was is they got very lucky.
In terms of having something to, I guess, make the movie feel timely that would grab the attention of an audience, yes, 100%.
Yeah. I mean, not on the bomb's effects or anything like that, but yeah, they gave it something to hang its hat on.
Mm-hmm. Right, like kind of a relevance, yeah.
Yeah, I suppose you could take out the nuclear bomb part and it would still make sense.
Yes.
The project or Process 97 or whatever it was called could just be a MacGuffin.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Fair enough.
Because they allude to throughout the film things like rocket launchers and experimental guns and things like that. So Process 97 could be anything. It's something that is going to tip the war in the favor of the Nazis, and we have to stop them from getting it. That's all that matters. It involves formulas, physicists. That's all we need to know.
Okay. That actually makes it make more sense, really.
Yeah.
The whole, because I didn't understand it being produced and then coming out exactly or more or less when the war ended.
Mm-hmm.
So really, but what it was they made a film and then the war happened to end.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so this movie had a budget of $400,000. It opened to $125,000 and recouped its budget in 3 weeks. It would go on to make about $2.5 million. So it was a hit. It wasn't like one of the top earners of the year, but it was a hit movie. It did make a little less than Nob Hill, I will note, that Henry Hathaway, his 2 movies this year. Nob Hill was the bigger hit, but this movie did well. The top 3...
Nob Hill was a bigger hit.
Yes, it was. And the top 3 for this year, number 1 was The Bells of St. Mary's, which was a sequel to the Bing Crosby film Going My Way.
Balls of St. Mary's.
Bringing the class to a classic work of cinema, Scott.
Keep going.
I've seen The Bells of St. Mary's. It's nowhere near as good as the first one. It's pretty schmaltzy stuff. Definitely a feel-good movie for kind of that end of World War II. People are tired, so they're going to go see The Bells of St. Mary's, but a lot of it feels a little bit like a Full House episode.
You gotta stop talking about the feels of the bells of St. Mary's.
Well,
you're just lining them up for me, man.
Scott, I have the perfect one lined up for you for the movie that landed then at number 2. It was a film called Mom and Dad. Now, I had never heard of Mom and Dad, and by and large, it's kind of rare to put a movie on a top 10 list for any given year that I scratch my head going, what is this? So I looked it up on IMDb to get the synopsis. Here is the synopsis of Mom and Dad. When a high school girl gets pregnant and the boyfriend dies, the sex ed teacher shows her a film about childbirth and the dangers of venereal disease.
Oh boy. Oh boy. The day Nob Hill met Clit House and made a baby.
I mean, wow. That is a movie that I'm sure is very dated.
I can you just imagine seeing that in like CinemaScope?
but people did. Big hit, #2 of the year. It must have just had a huge word of mouth on that one. Like, you have to have seen Mom and Dad. So, big hit. #3, though, was Leave Her to Heaven, which is a somewhat of a precursor to movies like Fatal Attraction or Basic Instinct. It stars Gene Tierney as a woman who very much sets her sight on a romantic interest she has in this man and pretty much tears his life apart. It is a great film. It's on the Criterion Collection. I own a copy. If you haven't seen Leave Her to Heaven, people, check it out. It's fantastic. But that was sort of the top 3 that year. What a weird top 3.
I just can't believe people actually went and saw a film about venereal disease.
Yeah.
Like, I know cinema was a different thing at different points in history. It wasn't necessarily like a escapist place that it is now. But I don't know. Why would you go to the cinema to? Ugh.
Well, I just think at that point too, like the idea of what cinema could offer, for a lot of people it was this glimpse inside things they didn't quite understand. So you had like these venereal disease being one of them. But you did have movies early on. Like I remember there was a Best Picture nominee called The White Parade, which is about like spending time with nurses in a hospital. Because maybe the average person doesn't really know what they do in a hospital. Like movies were travelogues, they were also taking you inside, jobs and things like that you didn't really understand. I just think like there was a lot of educational style films being made and people were really into. Even things later down the road like what is it called? The marijuana film that everyone went crazy about.
Reefer Madness.
Yeah, Reefer Madness. Like I think a lot of people watched that too. It's these educational films which feel very kitschy now. I just think there was like kind of like a buzz about them back in the day. It would be like, you wouldn't believe what they're saying about subject X. We have to go see it.
Well, I heard they did get buzzed
Mm,
on Reefer Madness.
true, yeah.
I gotta stop with these puns this evening. What have I been drinking? I don't know.
I don't know. So,
Uh,
the success of this movie actually led to a fair amount of influence. The House on 92nd Street is very much seen as helping to lead to other crime docudramas such as The Naked City and T-Men. Naked City is actually a pretty well-regarded film. I think it's on the Criterion Collection as well. So there was a trend coming out of this one of these sort of real-world-based docudramas that showed real police procedural type stuff, or in this case FBI. That was something audiences had a little bit of a hunger for after this movie. This movie also won an Oscar for writer Charles Booth for a category that no longer actually exists, but he won for Best Writing Original Story. So it was the story concept, not the script, that would have won. So, when you think of writers going in, pitching stories, coming up with a treatment, that's what he would win for, not the screenplay. So,
okay. We like your idea, just not what it became.
sure. Yeah, like the movie didn't have any other nominations. It wasn't up for acting or, best screenplay or best director or anything like that. But the story, I guess, really grabbed people. I just think, honestly, a lot of it was the timeliness and sort of the novelty of the FBI element. I think that probably made it stand out from the pack.
Well, if this is a first, as you say, of a docudrama, then yeah, I could definitely see it sort of leaving people with an impression in their minds, because I'm used to seeing these. And it's probably something in my notes I've commented on, like I've seen this done better
Yeah.
in modern day filmmaking, at least. But if this is the first docudrama ever made, then I'd say it probably did deserve the Oscar.
Yeah, yeah. It has that sort of crime procedural storytelling method that we'll talk about how well it's aged, but it feels like the sort of thing we're still watching on TV. Even when you watch something like CSI or another crime procedural, I think a lot of the elements you're seeing there are, kind of continuing on from what this movie was doing earlier, way back in 1945.
There was moments in this film where I was waiting for the Law and Order gavel noise and dun dun, just to pivot in between narrations. But,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Henry Hathaway was a good filmmaker, so he was someone he wasn't like a kind of like a studio hack. He was someone with some real credentials. He was a craftsman. So it's not like he would have made this to be something clunky at the time, but again, we'll talk about how well it's aged.
Well, that's probably where our discussion will lead. And we've spoken about Fritz Lang before, and my unfortunate experience with Metropolis. But Metropolis informed science fiction cinema, and in some ways still does.
Yeah.
Now that has aged pretty badly, I would
Ooh.
say at times.
In terms of the narrative is, and I don't even know how much to blame actually on Metropolis, because the movie has been compromised by missing sections, and I believe there
Hmm.
is a fairly new restored version that I haven't watched. I need to track it down, but it was a movie that for many years people were seeing in cut to pieces versions. So
Yeah. Well, I mean, I struggled when I watched it, but you can tell the signature is there. That is then grown on. The seed has been planted by that film. So maybe I have to appreciate it from that angle when we talk about this film. It is weird to say that it's an Oscar-winning film, though.
it is very strange. We did Argo fairly recently on the show, which was a Best Picture winner, and now we have another Oscar winner. So the prestige of this podcast is being lifted up entry by entry.
We're moving on up to 92nd Street.
That's right. And my final note, and this one I kind of love actually. Actor Lloyd Nolan, who shows up as Inspector George A. Briggs in this film, reprised that character. He actually appeared again. This character, played by this actor, showed up in the 1947 film The Street with No Name, which was another crime film, not the exact same type of film, but if those of you out there who are completists or want to continue the adventures of Inspector Briggs, check out The Street with No Name. I think I'm going to.
Is this another one of your like Condor Man comic follow threes? Like I'm never
Yeah,
going to watch it, but you will.
I will. I will totally watch The Street with No Name. Yeah.
Well, I'll leave you to spin off into Brig Cards.
I have so much to say about George Briggs in this movie. Like, so much to say. So that wraps up my behind the scenes on this movie, which, again, like when I sat down to do this one, sometimes when I've done movies from the 40s or 30s, it can be tough if you're not dealing with like A pictures. When you're doing notes on, like an old Hitchcock film, 39 Steps, there's tons of information to draw upon. But a lot of times when you're dealing with more obscure things, or even like actually Ministry of Fear, much tougher to come across really strong behind the scenes. This movie was a treasure trove. Like, those of you out there who are interested in delving into the world of this film, head over to, Turner Classic Movies. They've got articles and scholarly essays about this film. There's a lot out there on 92nd Street if you dig for it, and a lot of it's really interesting and has real world connotations involving, the real spy ring and World War II events and everything that make it historically interesting as well.
Why do you think that is?
I think just luck of the draw. Like, this movie's just was doing some things that grabbed the attention. It had very notable people, attached. We've done movies in the past where the movie may have been good, but the people attached to it didn't really talk about it or didn't have rich careers beyond that film. And this is one where you had some real heavyweights of Hollywood behind the scenes.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, I'm eager to pivot into our review because as this was kind of like an emergency ripcord pick a film scenario, we haven't really discussed it leading into it. So I think I'd like you to lead us off, Cam, as this is your pick. What do you think of The House on 92nd Street?
Okay, I want to preface this with, actually, you texted me last night. I watched it quite late at night. I started, I think, 11:30 in the evening. But you texted me before I sat down and pressed play saying, "Have you watched the film yet?" And you don't normally do that. I rarely ever get a text saying like, "Oh, have you watched Our Man Flint yet?" or, what have you, Argo. But this one I was like, well, that's curious. And then you made a reference and said like, I would like to watch this movie with a running commentary from you or something like that. And I was like, oh, what am I in for? And I'd done the research in advance, a lot of it, so I kind of knew what to expect. But this is a movie that is woefully dated. Like, woefully. We have talked about movies from earlier on. Mata Hari, 39 Steps. Those movies have aged far, far better as entertainments than this thing. But I found this movie kind of a hoot to watch in that it's so, so earnest, painfully earnest about its story. And the story is not that compelling. I think if you actually start to remove the narration, the very, very heavy-handed FBI participation, there's nothing to this movie. Like, it doesn't have a compelling story to tell whatsoever. This movie is entirely based on, look at what the FBI is doing. Isn't it incredible? They're showing you actual footage they took, just shooting random people walk in front of the German embassy in New York. And it's like, this is crazy. I'm watching, like, surveillance footage from 1940s. So, like, as a historical document, I found this movie fascinating. I was very thankful it was 88 minutes. That was the perfect amount of time. The acting across the board was stiff as a plank. Like, there was a point where I made a note in reference to the lead character, Bill Dietrich, who we follow, played by William Eythe. I made a note that said, imagine if you had the movie The Departed, set it during World War II, and replaced DiCaprio with a plank of wood. That is what this movie is. It's a, covert mission, undercover guy who's the most boring dude in the room. And honestly, I just found myself more won over by the novelty of the movie. Like, that's what made me interested in it. But as a piece of dramatic filmmaking, it's aged into just absolute decrepitude. Like, there's nothing left to really take in other than the the technical skill that was being shown at the time. That, again, we can talk about how well that's aged, but it's a movie that's just interesting more in concept than in what it actually is.
Usually I'll try and find something to nitpick about what you say with the film, but I really do agree with you. I wrote down, this is a film of two halves. There's a cool, not necessarily as in like time wise, but there's half of the film that is cool scenes of what happens with investigations, all the behind the scenes stuff, double sided mirrors, real FBI agents, and more of a documentary feel, something like you would see on the Discovery Channel. That was interesting. That is the sort of thing I would watch. And then you get put into this spy story, which is actually the story of the film. And as you said, you've got a bunch of wooden actors. Now, you've got Leo G. Carroll in here. SpyHards veteran Leo G. Carroll. And even he can't bring the level of acting up. Even he feels like he's bored the entire way through. So you've got nothing to latch onto in terms of a story. You don't particularly care. And you don't really give a monkeys about the information they're trying to protect. And you've got this you've got this protagonist who is a double agent, American-German, Bill Dietrich. And there's some of the worst acting I've ever seen. And I've seen The Room.
Yeah.
I've seen The Room with Tommy Wiseau in the room with me. And this is up there. I'm sorry, William Eythe.
The thing about Tommy Wiseau is, though, he goes for it. Like, when you see him in a movie, if you watch The Room, he is up one side and down the other. Like, he is over the top. He's crazy. He has unconventional approaches to dialogue. Very strange and very unself-conscious. Whereas, this is one of the really interesting elements of this movie, which is that it's going for realism, and it's going for the docudrama approach. Like, you are watching real events happen. Yes, it's actors and everything, but we want the audience to think they're watching a documentary, essentially. And it seems like in this era, what that meant was be really stiff. If you are playing a real person, walk around like you are a zombie, like you don't have any sort of personality, you do not have any sort of spontaneity, you talk in a very measured tone and basically give out these very perfunctory sentences. It doesn't feel real. It feels very stilted and awkward. And it's the approach of the time, and it's all over this movie. Like, it is all over that lead character of Bill Dietrich, and it extends to pretty much everyone else, except for my hero of the movie, which, I just have to say, Inspector Briggs. I want to talk more, maybe at length about him, but he was gold. I loved him so much. But yeah, Dietrich and so many of the other, German agents around him, they are all just, good lord. Good lord. Like, there is not a pulse among them.
I did not steal the plans. I did not steal them. I did not. Like, that's more interesting already. I get it. Yeah, it's a real shame. I was thinking about, I don't know if it's something they do in Canada or North America, but we have a show here called Crime Stoppers, and basically they reenact real crimes to try and get witnesses to call in or and that sort of thing. So they get actors usually to portray real people getting attacked or getting robbed, etc., etc. But they're playing it with real emotions and how someone would really react, but you're not taking that as a piece of entertainment. You're watching it as a factual thing. If that's what this was, it was probably okay. But this is pitched as a film, an entertaining spy story. So people just standing around, just like I was surprised that one of the actors didn't just like accidentally mug at the camera.
Mm.
Just and or like a boom would just sort of fall into the shot. Like it felt that low budget dram kind of performances. And as I said, Leo G. Carroll's here, and it literally I felt like it was on a rickety stage in the middle of a little town in a suburban place in England.
Yeah, well, you watch 39 Steps from a handful of years earlier, and like there's so much personality to each character. And the thing is, like, people have different rhythms to their speech. Like, not every person sounds the same. Anyone listening to this podcast is not going to mix up probably your voice with mine. This movie, though, follows, I think, a trend of the time that's very frustrating, is that they write every character to sound exactly the same. There's a little bit of difference. I do think, like, Signe Hasso, who plays Elsa, the villain of the movie, like, maybe she has a little more of a spark to her, but a lot of the characters all sound very flat and monotone. And no one is really the excitable one in the room. No one is the mysterious, quiet one. They all kind of just feel very like it's like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and it's just a group of pod people all having a conversation.
Yeah, there's no one that really like breaks out from the group. I know you want to talk about Inspector Briggs, but I have a feeling that's probably more of a taking a few shots across the bow at Inspector Briggs. He's not really jumping out to you as an Oscar-winning performance. And even in bad movies, you have someone you can look at as entertainment. Tommy Wiseau, back again. Um, think of something a bit more up to date. Tomorrow Never Dies. Okay, it's not the best Bond film, but you've got Jonathan Pryce mugging his way through it in a really entertaining way, and he's probably the best thing about the film. There's no Jonathan Pryce performance in here. There's nothing to latch onto to carry you through. It's just these really interesting narration sections, and then some really badly acted scenes, and then some narration wrapping up.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Why don't we just kind of mention as well, like, I've referenced this movie earlier, Argo, in some ways, is a descendant of a movie like this. Like, it is a docudrama telling a real-world event. It's a spy story. And you look at how much personality each of those characters has, and I am sure they did extensive research on each of the individuals they were portraying. They found the way to get them across on screen that they were memorable. Like, you want to care about these people, and they are based on real people. So, like, I don't understand why the approach here is like, we want all these characters to be thoroughly uninteresting and flat, when don't you want the audience to care? Like, Bill Dietrich, shouldn't the audience feel fear, when he's getting it over his head? There's a whole sequence where they're gonna, where they're injecting him with like truth serum, which I can only imagine in 1945 or whatever year this was, what a truth serum was they were injecting into you. God knows, my God, it must have been a nightmare. But there should be moments where you're genuinely on the edge of your seat. And a lot of people point to old movies and go like, well, how much tension can there really be? But Ministry of Fear, 39 Steps, they had tension. Mata Hari had some tension. There's moments where you're like kind of leaning forward, like, okay, how are they going to get out of this? This movie doesn't have any of that. Like, I couldn't have cared what happened to Bill Dietrich in that whole finale, even though some of it was really well shot.
Do you know? It just sprung to my mind. It's not in my notes, but it feels like this film is a documentary.
Yeah.
In the sense of they've got the real people to play themselves in a reenactment of the story.
Right.
So like you know how you can't really pretend to be yourself, so you become like this wooden, heady version of what you think you are. And like you have to try and reenact your movements, and you become really robotic. I feel like that's what they're going for.
Did you ever see the Clint Eastwood film 1517 to Paris from a couple years ago?
No, no.
Okay, it was about that the three American soldiers who thwarted the terrorist attack on the train.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that movie I think is horrible. Some people were fans of it, but I think it was pretty terrible in that they cast the real soldiers as the three leads of the movie and then had them restage scenes where they're just hanging out, joking around, and going on a European vacation. And it feels like pod people again. Like it doesn't feel like characters going through an actual experience as it's happening. It feels like a really stilted recreation, and it didn't work there. And this was an extra step more awkward because we're dealing with a new approach to this type of filmmaking. So they got to work out the kinks. They're not there yet. This is early on, so it's kind of an unformed concept so far. And we're watching actors try to do this in a style of acting that just does not work at all. It's not figured out at all. So 1517 I thought was terrible. This movie I found more watchable by a considerable margin. But it does have that same sort of like distance of this doesn't feel like real life. This feels, as you said, awkward to watch people recreate the story of their life.
It's like they're caricatures of themselves, but not interesting caricatures.
Yeah.
I will send some praise to the film. I do like the behind the scenes how the sausage was made investigation work done by, I'm guessing, the real FBI people. That was kind of cool to see. And whilst I found the narration to be mostly intrusive, because they would use it to like almost screen wipe like the Star Wars films would.
Yeah.
I did enjoy seeing the behind the scenes of the FBI. I thought that was quite cool, and it in that sense it probably does work as a propaganda film for them. But barring that, I couldn't find anything to latch onto. But I am curious to hear about your thoughts on Inspector Briggs.
Okay. I thought Inspector Briggs was amazing. I began to fall in love with this character because he was so dull. Like, imagine you're kind of, he's like the Dick Tracy of this movie. If you ever think of like the old Dick Tracy, cartoons or whatever, Dick Tracy's in The Office, and he's kind of this hard ass holding up, justice in the American way and all this sort of stuff. I'm a fan of like that Dick Tracy world. It's a lot of fun. And you have Briggs, who kind of plays the same role. He's the tough talking inspector in charge of the case. He's the one interrogating people, but he has zero charisma whatsoever. He's all, a jaw, like a square jaw and rigid, attitude, and he's going to get the job done, but in a totally uninteresting way. And I just began to be more and more pulled in by just how kind of like how square this character was. I really did enjoy him in a somewhat ironic way, but also by the end, everything he was doing in his hip to be square style was really working for me.
I wish I could send the praise to him. I just found him to be completely vanilla.
Exactly. It's the vanilla. It's the perfect, it is the personification of vanilla. And I kind of admired that. Like, it didn't feel boring. It felt like it was so vanilla, it couldn't be more vanilla. And somehow that made it cool.
You seem to be acting like that was a choice by the actor. I'm not convinced it was.
But it worked for me, damn it. I want the Briggs cinematic universe.
The BCU. There we go.
But
you're probably the only person to ever ask for that, but that's fine. That's fine.
He has some authority, I kind of dug it, but that you get so many scenes of him just in the office, and he is your kind of your focal point for all the FBI stuff. And I just love scenes where he would be like turning to someone and be like, what is the update on the fingerprints? And then an awkward FBI agent would turn around and be like, the result is we have a suspect. And Briggs would be like, okay, good news. Let's move.
It is exactly what you say when you say about pod people, and that's why I refer to it as like amateur dramatics. It feels like people who are just doing it for a school play. It's like they're doing a nativity scene or something.
Yeah,
away in a manger. It's a real shame that this film is headed up with I mean, he's probably the worst actor I've seen since Hayden Christensen, uh, who's coming back as Darth Vader apparently. No idea why. Maybe because they can put him in a mask. Um, but yeah, William Eythe or Eythe, I think it is. I can't imagine he went on to do much else because he is a charisma vacuum in this film.
He didn't do a lot after this. Well, he did a number of movies that are actually kind of acclaimed. He had like bit parts in things like the Oxbow Incident, which is a really good Western. Um, but not a lot. Some TV here and there. Although we should note he died very young. He died at the age of 38. So, yeah.
I mean, I'm just saying, you're older than 38 and you have no acting experience. I think you could probably do this better.
But how much of this is also the director? I mean, I'm not like arguing that William Eythe was like the greatest actor who ever lived, like the Laurence Olivier of his time or anything like that. Although I think Laurence Olivier was of that time, but nonetheless, the second Laurence Olivier. I'm not saying that at all, but I just wonder how much was the direction being like, no, play it down, realistic, no energy, like remove that sort of the inflections from your voice. We want this to be real, and it's just not real. It's the 1945 concept of what is real.
I don't know if I could blame it on that. I think there's some other bits and bobs of this film that may be borderline on interesting in terms of direction.
Mm-hmm.
This is more of a cinematography thing, but there's one shot I remember where he goes to the dress store run by Elsa Gebhardt, and you see her in the reflection, and then like the camera sort of pans around to see her and him walking up. I think that was actually a really nice shot.
Yeah.
Probably the only good shot in the entire film.
Yeah.
But maybe that's more cinematography than director. I don't know.
Well, I will say like a lot of the actors reminded me of there's stories like relating to Stanley Kubrick or David Fincher, where you hear about how they'll have an actor do like 99 takes of an insignificant moment or a line of dialogue, something like that. And the whole reason they do that is because they want the actors to stop acting. And essentially it just becomes natural. They are just at a certain point going through the motions, so it becomes actual behavior they're filming as opposed to a performance. And I'm not saying they made any of the actors do 99 takes here, but it feels like they did. The energy is gone.
Oh yeah, there's definitely no energy in the room, and I keep harkening back on to Leo G. Carroll, but he is an actor I know can deliver.
Yeah.
So what they did to make him a complete square, I don't know. Whether maybe the actors weren't paid enough. The only thing I can think about as well is if this was made during wartime, were a lot of the main actors in Hollywood, enlisted?
Yeah, I mean, a number of them were for sure, quite a few. And as well as directors and various other filmmakers were working for the war effort. But it was actually intended right from the start. They wanted to cast unknowns here to have more of a sense of realism. This is early in Leo G. Carroll's film career, relatively. He doesn't do North by Northwest for like another decade. So, he would have been someone who I'm sure was kind of a known character actor, but it's not like he's the co-star on the Man from U.N.C.L.E. TV show or anything like that. He's someone who's, a working actor.
Okay. Well, one other thing I had a problem with this film is its patriotism.
Mm-hmm.
We made some jokes at the top of the show about it being sponsored by the FBI and stuff like that, but this is a movie that actually manages to work in the national anthem into its own score.
Yeah.
I felt that was a little bit egregious for a film that's meant to have international distribution. Maybe it was just aimed at an American audience when it was put out. That's fair enough.
Yeah, it would have been, I think, because, I mean, I don't know that movie theaters were doing particularly well in a lot of Europe during World War II. I think this would be very much a American audience film, and they wouldn't be worried about opening movies, say, in China or anything, territories like that in these days.
I suppose I can understand it from that point, but as a surly Brit, I don't want to get up to the national anthem, and so when they blare it into my speakers, I get kind of turn my nose up a little bit, really.
there's so much darkness to this movie, entirely unintended. This movie sees itself as very much a rah for the FBI. Like, we are the heroes. We have all these scenes of FBI agents filming the public through windows, hiding in cars, just filming people working at like a factory. And it's a lot of it is real footage that they were taking. We see scenes where the FBI is watching footage of all this stuff. To which I made a note: how boring would it be to sit and watch all that footage? My God, you'd be earning those
Oh,
paychecks.
there's a worse FBI job I wrote down.
Oh, what's that?
The lipstick matcher.
Oh yeah, having to investigate the brand of lipstick that a spy is using and track it back to her. Yeah, totally. That's very boring. But this movie sees itself as very much tooting the horn for the hardworking people of the FBI. It doesn't recognize the issues that authority would bring later. Like, the House of Un-American Activity stuff was a nightmare and led to a lot of dark chapters in that country, and the FBI played a very large role, and Hoover, his investigations into people. None of that is acknowledged in this movie. Obviously, it has FBI oversight, but it also seems oblivious to a lot of what it's saying, because you have, them talking about the Hiroshima bomb. They talk about rounding up enemy agents and putting them in internment camps. And a lot of this is actually Japanese citizens we see on screen. This movie, I mean, it's made in 1945. This movie has absolutely no understanding of the legacy the internment camps would have in the future and how it would become a very dark chapter in American history. This movie sees it as a triumph and presents it as such, being completely oblivious to how history is going to look back on that story. So the movie becomes very fascinating in that way, in that it is a propaganda film released at a very crucial moment in history that doesn't understand the history that's going to be told later down the road.
Well, I mean, you can't make films with future knowledge.
No.
But this is one of the questions I had that I was going to pivot onto. Is I don't know who they made this film for, because it doesn't really feel like a propaganda film as I know it. And apart from to try and get people to head down to Quantico to sign up, I don't know what it was really aiming for. And so I suppose, my question is, well, there's two questions. But the first one is, if this is based on real events, loosely,
Yeah.
Is this how you should portray it? Because I think there's actually quite a cool story in here if you dig down. But if I was given this story and I was a screenwriter or I was a director, I would not, smother it with narration and clips of FBI stuff. So why was it pieced together like this? I don't understand who this film was for.
So I think part one to your question, I think this movie was an attempt also to establish the FBI as a presence that the American people could rely on, because they're in a very fragile state at the end of World War II, and they want to say, don't worry, the FBI is in charge and they are looking after you. You're going to be okay. I think they want you to look at the FBI in that light. Your takeaway is, we're okay. Our life can go forward because the FBI is on the watch for any insurgents and enemy agents that could compromise our safety. So I think that's part of it. But also, in terms of the real world story, I agree with you. Like, I think the Duquesne spy ring, you could probably make a really great movie about that now. That's something that you could make maybe a really good Netflix documentary series about. Maybe a 2.5 hour long drama or something you would see in a theater. This is not really the way to translate it, but I also think they wanted to translate a very clear-cut, raw for the FBI story. So I think they filed down any complications to the real story as to maybe what went on. They made it very black and white. Is it interesting for an audience now? No. But maybe at the time they would look at this and be like, well, they wouldn't have the media literacy that people do now. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like I agree with you. I think this would make a really interesting Netflix movie. Maybe not a cinematic release, but I think there's a story in here that could be quite interesting, much like The Courier, which we spoke about recently.
Mm-hmm.
Spy stories at this level can be interesting and can be portrayed in a way that would engage the audience, but this is the opposite of that. This actively seeks to push people away, I feel like.
And it feels very clunky to watch it now because as if the patriotic stuff and the FBI cheerleading isn't enough to make people kind of roll their eyes. Um, the film craft, there's shots in here that are nice. I thought the actually attack on the villains at the end where they're firing gas canisters through the windows, like that was pretty effectively shot. But
Sure.
a lot of it's very clunky, and a lot of it is we want this to feel like cameras capturing real life, but we are a long ways away from Paul Greengrass doing like United 93 or the work he would obviously, tie into the Bourne stuff. It does not have that sort of life to it, that cinema verite quality, which didn't even really exist in 1945 in popular filmmaking. So you get a lot of awkwardly framed shots, like moments where like an actor stands up and their like head's cut off or something in the frame, and it's to make it look like you're watching, I guess documentary footage or something, but it just looks clunky and awkward as opposed to documentary footage.
And I think a lot of that also just goes to how the actors are portraying the characters. There's a scene where Bill Dietrich meets the rest of the German spy ring in the dress store.
Yeah.
And they're all sort of sat around this little office at the back, and they just don't move.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're all just either sat in their chairs or stood up, staring at each other for about 5 minutes, just talking. No one moves to sit down. It's like a steady shot. The camera is just on them the entire time. It doesn't like cut to other people's faces particularly often, once or twice. And you just think like this isn't real. But this whole film hinges on it being a real story.
Yeah.
But maybe, as you say, maybe people's experience with film was I don't know. Maybe they weren't expecting as much back in 1945.
I just think also it's maybe a little trendy. Like it kicks off a trend, right? And I think there's good films that come out of that trend, but this isn't held up as one of the gems of those films. And I just wonder if at the time it felt new and fresh, felt different from the other stuff you'd be seeing at that time at the multiplex, or well, not even multiplex, at the theater. And it it was for its time. Back then they would have thought, "Oh, this is interesting. I'm getting an inside look at the FBI." And I'm sure the FBI is something that people are talking a lot about. We're I guess 20 years past the Chicago crime battles and everything against the Capone crime syndicate, but the FBI is something that people see as heroes a lot of the time. You have all the Elliot Ness stuff and all the stories coming out of that, and then continuing on here. I think people would have just had an interest, whereas nowadays, obviously, we have much more of a complex relationship with the FBI. Shows like The X-Files, our heroes are FBI agents, but the show's very much about exposing the dirty dealings of the FBI and the conspiracies and many of the historical issues that they've been tied to. This movie doesn't have any of that perspective and doesn't want to. It's just, hey, audience, come hang out with the FBI for the day.
Yeah. Well, I did have one more question, and this is really about the spy story underneath everything here. And there is a twist in this film. There's this character, this elusive Mr. Christopher, who holds the power to the German spy ring in New York or in America, by the sounds of it. And you're fed these red herrings as to who is Mr. Christopher, but it's revealed at the end that Elsa Gebhardt's character is basically cross-dressing as a man to be Mr. Christopher.
Yeah.
I actually didn't see that coming. Did you?
Yes, but only because I'd done some research in advance. So yeah, I did, but she was a very unconvincing man when they showed her on screen. But it was kind of a fun little twist. I don't know that it would have been shocking in those days, because I think there'd probably been movies that had pulled this sort of twist, but it was fun to see. It gave the movie, I think, maybe a spark of life that just wasn't there any other time.
Yeah, it couldn't hang its hat on that alone. I was convinced it was Leo G. Carroll, which I think is what the film was trying to get you to think it was for a good time.
Yeah.
And then when I saw her disappear into the back and become Mr. Christopher, I was actually okay. it wasn't a cloak and dagger level of seeing the glove come off and reveal the two fingers missing.
Sure.
That's still one of my favorite moments. But it surprised me at least, and that whole ending with the assault on the Nazi base, well, Nazi head hideout, I suppose is the correct term, was quite an interesting sequence as well. But it definitely wasn't enough to salvage the film for me.
Yeah, I mean, I completely understand. There was little bits though that it's just like it would kind of make me smile moments where I would just go, "Oh, that's kind of fun." Like delving into the world of the spy stuff because I don't think the spy story is interesting. I don't think they have a compelling spy story on screen. Everything is propped up with narration. They do not have a story here. They just have a narrator telling you how dramatic things are without actually showing you anything dramatic really happening on screen. It's like the classic case of the show don't tell being very much ignored. But there was moments where they talk about how the Nazi spies are using like a memory artist to memorize the formulas for Process 97 to smuggle it out. And I couldn't help but think of Mr. Memory in the 39 Steps. So I enjoyed stuff like that. I also very much enjoyed when they introduced Arthur C. Appleton, physicist. A man who does nothing. They give him this whole introduction, and you're like, okay, Arthur C. Appleton, physicist, let's see what you're going to do. And he proceeds to do nothing of interest in the movie.
Well, he's the guy who, forgive me if I'm wrong, but he says he'll manipulate the data to throw the Nazis off, right?
Yeah.
I was convinced that was a real person, not an actor.
Yeah.
Just from the way they were talking in the scene, it just felt really unnatural, and it didn't even look like the way the shot was framed. And I know you and I can see each other currently, but like you could see Inspector Briggs kind of talking at him whilst kind of looking directly down the camera, whereas this guy was his face was to the left so that you could see half of his face, and he would never really look like he was acting to Inspector Briggs or to the camera. He was just saying his lines as if he was almost reading off the table and looking forwards. And so I was convinced that was a real professor or something like that.
Probably. He probably was a real physicist they dredged up for this. I'm just scrolling through the cast list on IMDb, and I don't know, I'm not seeing him. Oh, there he is. He actually was played by a guy named Jack McKee, but I don't know, maybe Jack McKee was a real scientist. Who knows? No, he popped up in a couple bit parts, but he wasn't really an actor. He was a reporter in the prologue of a movie called Gang War and district attorney in a movie called Polygamy. Wow, that sounds like something from 1936. So I don't know who this guy was, but Arthur C. Appleton, character for the ages, new icon, new mascot for SpyHards podcast.
Move over, Uramov.
Who wins the Oromov Award in this movie?
It's kind of hard to tell they're sweating because no one's acting hard enough to be sweaty. Maybe the narrator.
Oh yeah, because it is overdone narration to the nth degree. Like whenever you watch an old Simpsons episode where they show like a dated educational video or something, and you have that really cornball narration, that is going through this entire movie. It's crazy. Have you ever seen the movie The Beast of Yucca Flats?
No.
Okay, it's a really bad horror movie from I think the 50s. I'm pretty sure it has that whole atomic edge to it about a mutant that happens in the Yucca Flats and pursues, some people. It's like a bargain basement production, but they didn't shoot any dialogue for the movie, so the whole thing is done in narration. And whoever did the narration, I'm not even sure they ever watched the movie because it feels like they're just waxing poetic about whatever pops into their head in the moment. It does not line up with half of what's going on screen. It's insane. I recommend people watch it. Next time you want to have a bad movie night, sit down and watch The Beast of Yucca Flats because it is comic gold. But a lot of that sort of awkward narration feels like the same thing you're getting here, just this one's a little more on point in terms of what you're actually seeing on screen.
I've not got really much more to say about this film in particular.
Yeah.
But I don't want to jump into the knock list just yet. I just don't know whether I did enjoy watching this film. That's evident from our chat. I'm not sure whether it was necessarily a bad film of its time. Like, I find it hard to contextualize it for someone sitting in a theater in 1945 because this obviously did well.
Yeah.
I mean, then again, this is the same year the movie about venereal diseases came second, so maybe everyone's taste in 1945 was absolute, you know, venereal disease. Um, but I just don't know whether this is a good film or not. I didn't enjoy it, so maybe to me it's not. But is there merit in here, Cam?
Historically, yes. I think film scholars would probably have fun taking it apart piece by piece and looking at it as an early example of the docudrama. But for a general audience wanting to watch a spy film, hells no. There's nothing here whatsoever. So yeah, that would be my answer to that.
Well, that's 3 hours of my life.
Yeah,
Thank you, SpyHards.
what was it like the second time through?
It's actually really interesting because usually I will always say my second time through helped. Like my expectations were put away in the first one, I just opened myself up in the second viewing and whatnot. But because this film had nothing to offer in terms of plot or acting, the intrigue was there in the first one because it was kind of like, oh, this is like a docudrama. This is quite interesting for the time. I'm seeing these bits. The FBI stuff's kind of interesting,
Yeah.
but seeing that twice is useless. So the second viewing was completely useless. What's the point in watching a documentary twice? You can't learn the same thing twice.
Right? Yeah.
Well, you can, but you know what I mean. Like, there's no value in rewatching this film. There's barely any value in watching it at all.
I would say though, anyone interested in docudramas about criminal investigation of this sort of era, movies that are a little clunky but maybe have a little bit of a glimpse at that behind the scenes kind of stuff. There's actually one, I'm not going to say it's great, but it was interesting, called The Tattooed Stranger. I watched a while back, and it's about the implementation of advanced FBI techniques for criminal investigation. In that film, they find a body in a car, and it's about how they actually track who this person was, who murdered them, and it's, you know, at this point they're fascinated by fingerprints, for example, and the movie has that kind of like fly on the wall, can you believe what you're seeing, relating to, I think, an element of investigation that's a little more interesting to wrap your head around, and at least easier for people to wrap their heads around it than what this movie's doing. Like, a lot of what it is doing is showing basic things about like wiretapping and radio communication, but I don't know that that's interesting to watch as much. And it's tougher to kind of draw the conclusions as to how the radio signal stuff leads to an outcome for audiences now. I think the Tattooed Stranger's a little more watchable.
Okay. You just reminded me of the scene where Dietrich is caught by the spies because of the size of his antenna is not big enough.
Mm.
Was that supposed to be a tense moment? Because there was no energy in that room.
No. I don't think there was any tension whatsoever. Maybe it was supposed to be because, again, you're watching reality unfold before you.
Yeah, people in 1945 had no standards for cinema.
Well, here's the question. Is this the most dated movie we've covered on the show?
Yes. I don't have to think about it. I would sooner... I've said to you before, and I've gone on record, I struggle with older films.
Mm.
I'm a child of the late 80s. I'm used to popcorn action cinema. I can stretch myself maybe to a David Lynch. You know, I can push my boundaries to, you know, Fincher, maybe a Cronenberg if I have to. Something like that. Or, you know, Hitchcock is enough to keep me going because he's a very inventive filmmaker.
Yeah.
And like Masahari, even I found things to enjoy in that.
Yeah.
We still talk about that Sacred Candle.
Sure. Yeah.
But this film has no redeeming qualities for me. None whatsoever.
When we started this podcast, and we had a lot of movies on the list from, you know, the 30s, 40s, and you're not someone who watches a lot of older films, was this movie sort of what you had in mind that you'd be getting from those? Like, is this what you more imagined 1930s, 40s movies to be?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like, nothing to get from it. Wooden acting, no pacing, no thrills, which is why I was pleasantly surprised by like the 39 Steps.
Yeah.
A thrilling film. Like, it kept you on the edge of your seat, despite it being made, what, 15 years before this?
The
Ish?
39 Steps, it's about a decade before.
Okay, sure. But that's 10 years. Life it changes a lot in 10 years.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, I was just expecting boring, boring films. And look, Cam, you delivered.
Well,
You said on the Ipcris file, you want boring, give me boring. Well, you finally gave me boring. Thank you very much.
and Boring's name is Inspector George A. Briggs. Hero.
We know what's inside the house on 92nd Street. Nothing at all.
I did always laugh too whenever they talked about the Christopher case, the Christopher case, the Christopher case throughout this movie. You could make a drinking game out of how many times they said the Christopher case. And my God, when it was like, and thus the Christopher case ended, I was like, hells yeah.
I want that narration guy, I'm sure he's dead now, to just record our intro or something.
That guy must have done narration on like everything in that era. He just has that voice. I'm sure this guy has narrated everything.
He's got that trailer voice. Like nowadays, they're all like, in a world where blah blah blah.
Yeah.
Yeah. He has the right voice for doing it. He was working overtime, so he wins out over a Moth Award, absolutely.
War is thought, and thought is information.
Okay, Cam. It's time I asked you a question. And that question is, why have you stolen 3 hours from my life? No. That question is the house on 92nd Street making the illustrious knock list?
I was tempted to put it on purely for Briggs, who is the greatest man who ever lived. No, this is a big flat no for me. There's just some movies that really have no reason to exist beyond scholarly research. This is one of those movies. Like, I think, film students might find it interesting, but as an entertainment, it's dead on arrival now. It's just interesting as a piece of propaganda, and to remind you of an era where, Hoover and sort of the public relations of the FBI was all about kind of getting in front of the public and presenting itself as heroes. Like, in terms of being FBI propaganda, interesting. As a dramatic spy story, there's absolutely nothing here whatsoever. So, it is a skip for spy fans and I don't know, I guess I recommend for FBI propaganda fans.
Yeah, I'm on the same page. I won't draw it out. It's a no from me. As someone, I mean, Cam, as I've discussed in the past, you are, well versed in film. You've been studying film for a very long time. You've been writing reviews for films for a very long time as well. You might be able to find something in this you can take from it, just from a scholarly perspective, as you say. I have none of those particular set of skills. I just watch films, and this had absolutely nothing for me. And so I hate it.
Which would you rather watch again? This or Little Drummer Girl?
That's a real toughie. Like if you said this or Men in Black 2, I'd choose Men in Black 2.
Yeah.
Little Drummer Girl though was a painful 2 hours of a lot of crying. At least this was quicker. I'd rather watch this again because it's quicker than Little Drummer Girl.
Right. Yeah, it's a movie like this is kind of painless for me to watch. The runtime contributes a great deal. Had this movie been 2 hours, I don't think I would have had maybe the sense of humor about it that I do now. But it was a curiosity for me. I'll say that. Like, it was a curiosity that I'm glad I watched, and there's no way in hell I'll ever watch it again.
Well, I need to ask you before we move on. Is there another list that this film might make?
I don't think for me, no.
Okay.
And I'll say why, and that's because of the influence it had, and that it's sort of one of the building blocks of a genre that continues to this day. I think when we're talking about kind of the worst of the worst,
And by list, I mean the newly christened Disavowed list, which chronicles the worst films we've covered, such as Men in Black 2, One of Our Dinosaurs is Missing, and the Harry Palmer TV movies. Cam, you were saying?
yeah, so like I get it, like as dramatic storytelling, it's pretty bad, but I just feel like it contributed something, and just given the people behind it, I think this movie has at least sort of a bit of an artistic legacy, and um, I found it again. Like I know you were really bored. I found it more interesting, even if it was very flat. So that's why I have a hard time putting it with movies that I found. Some of them very offensive, and others just so bad. There's no reason to ever watch it.
Well, okay. We won't discuss it any further because we have to have a unanimous vote for it to make the Disavowed list, so we'll leave it there. I guess I'm going to go spend the rest of the evening watching venereal disease movies to try and cheer myself up after this.
Although that's what you do most nights, right?
Well, of course, it's the perfect dessert to our chats.
Exactly.
And as such, the house on 92nd Street is not making the knock list, and the dossier is complete and filed as classified. Now, Cam, before we talk about what we're doing next week, we have a quick message from Chris over at the Podtastic Audio podcast. Roll that clip.
Hey, do you have a podcast, or maybe you're just thinking about starting a podcast? Well, I am Chris from Podtastic Audio, and here I show you tips and tricks on how to make your audio sound the best it possibly can with the gear you already have. With 2 years of experience on the Chris and Christine show, creating the finest audio I possibly can make, I will show you the tips and tricks I have used on that show to make the audio sound fantastic. So if you have any podcast-related questions to your audio, you always can email me at podtasticaudio@gmail.com, like this guy here did. His name is Joe. Joe writes in from the cast. Hey Chris, when we all sit down together to record our episode, our audio is too low and it has a lot of echo in the recording. How do we make our show sound better? Well, Joe, is the microphone you're using rhyme with the name Betty? And is that microphone in the same room with you? I'd start with that stuff first. And for more Podtastic Audio information, you can go to anchor.fm/Podtastic Audio, and you keep on making your amazing podcast.
And that was, of course, the Podtastic Audio podcast. We've guested over there before, and if you ever want some advice on how to improve the audio of your podcast, or if you do Zoom calls for work or anything like that, Podtastic Audio is the place to be. Cam, what are we doing next week?
Well, I know this was a rough journey for you, Scott, so we're going to jump onto a movie that I think is really going to win you back, and that is Pierce Brosnan's fourth James Bond film, 2002's Die Another Day. We're closing out the Brosnan era strong.
I could learn to like it.
If I had the time.
I'm looking forward to closing the door, in a way, on the Pierce Brosnan Bond chapter. This is the only one of his films I saw in the cinema and haven't watched since.
Oh, interesting.
I'm not going to let you... you can take it from that what you want about my experiences watching the film.
Mm-hmm.
But I haven't revisited, and we have a very special guest joining us next week as well. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, this is going to be a lot of fun. Any Bond film is interesting to talk about, and there's no shortage of topics for us to bring up related to Die Another Day.
From my memory, it will certainly give us some things to discuss.
For sure.
Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to watch Die Another Day and join us next week. Of course, The House on 92nd Street did not make the knock list, but you can find the films that did at letterboxd.com/SpyHards. And we are, of course, a proud member of Quite the Thing Media Podcast Network, and you can find out more about that on quitethingmedia.com. Now, don't forget to follow us discreetly on social media at SpyHards. That's SpyHards on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. But until next week, listeners, Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming?